Once upon a time, the USS Maine exploded, America goes to war with Spain, and then refuses to leave Cuba, causing further conflicts for 30 years. So you're wondering how we ended up in this situation? Well, let's start from the beginning. In 1868, a group of revolutionaries in Cuba revolted against the Spanish government, demanding independence, the implementation of a republic, and the end of slavery. Spain fiercely rejected these requests and shut down the rebellion with militaristic force. Because the revolt shook Spain, however, they could not afford another one. To attempt to appease Cubans, Spain abolished slavery in Cuba and gave Cubans more representation in their government. This, however, was not enough to satisfy the Cubans. They were hungry for independence. It was only 10 years later that a second struggle for independence was roused among the people. At the head of the uprising was José Martí, a Cuban poet who had been forced to leave Cuba due to his revolutionary activities. From the United States, he rallied Cubans with his calls for freedom and justice. Unfortunately, on his way to lead the revolt, Martí was killed in combat, but his inspiration didn't die with him. With the situation in Cuba spinning out of control, Spain sent a new commander, General Valeriano Weyler, to extinguish the growing revolt. Weyler forced thousands of Cubans into overcrowded, unsanitary reconcentration camps that provided almost no shelter or food. Americans sympathized with the Cubans, urging their leader to take action. Many American investors worried their Cuban investments were at risk. President Grover Cleveland remained strictly neutral, yet his successor, William McKinley, felt pressure by not only the public but the media as well. Newspapers practiced yellow journalism, in which authors like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer sensationalized news, detailing the courage of Cubans and the true treachery of Spanish rule. Reporters intended to gain more newspaper subscribers, which they accomplished, but also roused public support for the United States to intervene. Spain, however, also heard the cries of the Cubans and assured greater self-rule in Cuba. They removed General Weyler, and as a result, the situation in Cuba cooled down. Yet, in February 1898, two events finally pushed Americans past their threshold of outrage. Hearst published a letter written by Spanish ambassador Enrique Dupuy de Lomé, which called President McKinley, quote, weak and catering to the table, and besides, a low politician, end quote. De Lomé offered his resignation, but his actions were irreversible and the damage was done. Anti-Spanish feelings began to fester in the hearts of Americans. Not long after the De Lomé letter, a more tragic incident occurred. A battleship named USS Maine was sent out to Cuba as a precaution to protect American citizens residing there. Unfortunately, the ship exploded and sunk in the Havana harbor. Though the true cause of the explosion was up to speculation, Americans automatically blamed the Spanish. Thus, the United States officially joined the Cuban efforts against Spain. The U.S. Army in Cuba consisted of various forces. They relied on 4 regiments of African American soldiers as well as a volunteer one led by Theodore Roosevelt himself, called the Rough Riders. These men varied from college athletes to Western cowboys. Troops were led by General William Shafter, who fought courageously at the Battle of San Juan Hill. In 4 months after the conflict had arisen, after many victories and heavy losses of life, the war was over and the Americans were victorious. The Treaty of Paris was set for ratification on August 12, 1898, and by December 10th it was signed. As part of the treaty, Spain granted independence to Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and gave the Philippines to the United States in exchange for $20 million. The United States remained in Cuba, however, to restore and aid its recovery. Though the United States is long gone from Cuba nowadays, the country still holds the naval base of Guantanamo Bay, and American companies still have control of Cuba's economy. Back to the war, however, the Spanish and Cubans had a different view about American involvement in Cuba, as opposed to the American view that the Spanish purposely blew up the USS Maine. The Spanish were doing everything they could to avoid war with the US. Both the US and Spain knew that such an act of war would result poorly for Spain, which is why Spain and Cuba believed the explosion was a mistake. The US manipulated this incident to formulate a reason to go to war. The Cubans also believed that the United States violated the Treaty of Paris, which stated that the US would leave the island once World War I ended. the US once again manipulated their way through that agreement by adding provisions to the Cuban Constitution known as the Platt Amendment, which allowed the US to intervene in Cuban affairs. On top of that, American companies already had significant control over Cuban economy, thus taking advantage of the nation while the US government claimed it was protecting Cuba from anarchy and chaos. The United States stayed in Cuba for over 30 years after the war. Whether one interpretation of this event is more correct than the other does not really have a right clear answer, as both sides had good points. The US would actually aid Cuba and it did help it recover, but it did not leave Cuba when it promised to leave. According to the Treaty of Paris, the Americans did not have the right to expand their territory to Cuba. However, both liberty and opportunity were promoted during the entire process of the Spanish American War. America acted as a beacon of liberty for Cubans, stopping the strict Spanish control of the island. Opportunity was promoted for Americans, as the island of Cuba provided to many American businesses economically, thus allowing them to profit. Although it is impossible to say who was completely in the right or wrong, the Spanish-American War was another example of a country being liberated from its European oppressors, another example of liberty being restored and independence being established.